Welcome everyone, thank you for joining me. This is lecture 6 of my short course on livelihood research. This lecture is about social protection policies and how these policies can counter social exclusion and enhance livelihoods of the poor. My name is Leo de Haan, I'm from the Netherlands. Give me a moment to share my screen. I'm Emeritus Professor of Development Studies. Before my retirement, I was rector of the Institute of Social Studies in The Hague in the Netherlands. The ISS is the oldest and leading development studies institute in the world. Before my appointment at ISS, I directed the African Studies Center in Leiden, the largest center of its kind in Europe. I was trained as a human geographer, and throughout my academic career, I have focused my research on livelihoods in Africa. This course is on the MA level, and it is open to all interested students anywhere in the world. The purpose of the short course is to make you familiar with livelihoods research and to inspire you to use it. In lecture 5, I explained that by putting social exclusion rather than poverty at the core, livelihoods research has arrived where it belongs, at the analysis of encompassing issues of domination, power and social exclusion. And I presented a 3-layered model of livelihoods analysis. First, access to resources and opportunities. Second, underlying power relations and power struggles. And third, impeding structure. This lecture 6 focuses on social protection policies to counter social exclusion. This short course also has a second objective, call it a reflective objective. That reflective objective is about contextualizing livelihood research against the backdrop of a critical assessment of development studies itself. Any topical interpretation and practice of livelihoods research can only be achieved through this second objective. Social protection is usually defined as public policies and interventions that are meant to prevent destitution and to promote welfare. This lecture starts with an overview by contextualizing social protection in development. In this overview, I will discuss the rise of social protection, explain the main social protection instruments and highlight some controversies. In the second section, I will discuss the way social protection enhances poor people's livelihoods. 4 successive elements are discussed: protection, prevention, promotion and transformation, and I will pay special attention to the graduation approach. So let's start with contextualizing social protection in development. Social protection only entered the development debate in the late 1990s. The origin of modern social protection rather lies in the rise of the European welfare states at the end of the 19th century. Industrialization, urbanization and population growth has substantially weakened traditional forms of social protection offered by family network, churches and guilds, with massive poverty as a result. By then, various societal forces, ranging from labor unions, charities and political parties to churches and civil servants, combined efforts to enforce all sorts of corrective measures. Think of health and accident insurances, old age pensions and unemployment benefits. These corrective measures aim to prevent deprivation and to promote welfare. In the development debate, social protection took up a marginal position for a long time. It was associated with the welfare state of the industrialized countries and considered too costly for development countries. It never grew beyond insurances and pension schemes for a limited number of formal sector workers such as civil servants, railway employees and military. Moreover, even in the welfare states of the industrialized countries, social protection went out of favor due to rising costs, economic crisis, and the rise of the neoliberal ideology. In the 1980s, the World Bank strongly opposed broad social protection schemes in developing countries and only agreed to minimal safety nets for the most vulnerable. These safety net programs were the first social protection schemes to emerge in many developing countries. Fully in line with the neoliberal ideology at the time, they started off as the most minimalist approach to social protection. That is literally the final resort for those who could not keep pace with the restructuring of the economy by the structural adjustment programs. That restructuring was considered necessary to cope with the large debt of developing countries, and the medication was the usual mix of privatization, deregulation, and liberalization. Typical were the food for work programs meant to ensure a minimal level of food security for mostly rural populations that otherwise would suffer from seasonal hunger after the abolishment of food and input subsidies. These programs offered employment paid in cash or kind, for example, in the construction of roads or anti-erosion structures. The self-targeting mechanism reduced participation and cost to a minimum. The idea was to set the food ration so low that those otherwise earning enough wage or producing enough food to feed themselves would not be interested in the hard work involved. However, practice proved obstinate. In rural India, the wage was sometimes set so low that although participants worked on average 160 days in the program, 90% of them were still living under the local poverty line. Moreover, the weakest segments of the population, that is, the elderly, the disabled, and women caring for small children, were usually not able to profit from the food for work programs, especially when food for work programs put more emphasis on the building of infrastructure than on the distribution of food, that is the safety net function. These weaker segments of the population were excluded and preference was given to able-bodied men. Eventually, it turned out that structural adjustment did not deliver economic growth. So the idea that only minimal safety nets were needed to cater for the few that were left behind was false. The devastating social effects of structural adjustment programs in Africa, the Asian economic crisis, persistent global poverty, and mounting global social inequalities prompted even the World Bank to embrace social protection as part of poverty reduction strategies. Nowadays, social protection is no longer perceived as a dedicated policy to protect the most vulnerable against instant economic shocks. It has become an overall development strategy. However, consensus is not unanimous and social protection remains politically contested. Social protection is usually divided in three main categories. First, social insurance mechanisms, which safeguard participants against the negative material effects of sickness, maternity, invalidity, old age, and employment. Contributions from workers and their employees typically provide the financial basis for these insurance mechanisms. Secondly, social assistance mechanisms which provide support in various forms to the poor, for example, cash transfers, vouchers, and school meals. These mechanisms are typically tax-based. Thirdly, labor market regulations which protect workers by enforcing minimal wages, job security, and work standards and ensuring trade union rights. These regulations are usually embedded in legislation. Occasionally, broader definitions of social protection are used. These include all services that enhance human capital, like education, community development, health and sanitation. Sometimes social protection is broadened even further to include other public policies, even macroeconomic policies. For example, in the 1960s and 1970s, subsidizing food prices was a popular policy in developing countries, keeping down food prices for consumers of staples like rice, maize, and wheat. For many reasons, like corruption, increased burden on the state budget, and the favoring of urban consumers over rural producers, food subsidies fell into disfavor. However, they did represent a blanket social protection mechanism. Subsidies on agricultural inputs like fertilizer had the same intention. Note that some countries still provide food vouchers to the poor, enabling them to buy food at low prices in government shops. Despite points of agreement, social protection in development also remains the subject of fierce debate. Most fundamental is the controversy between the moral argumentation of equity and social justice and the efficiency argument of unleashing human and productive potential. The former departs from the idea that all members of society perform their task as good as they can and are given what they need, while the latter argues that poverty is a waste of human productive potential, weakens social unity, risks social unrest, and therefore reduces economic growth. Next is the question of universalism versus particularism. That is, whether social protection should cover the entire population or just particular groups, for example, those in need or those who paid contributions. Proponents of universalizing social protection argue that social protection is a claimable entitlement and that reserving it to a particular group risks fragmentation and inadequate accessibility. That would, in the end, threaten human security and solidarity and push inequality and poverty. It also follows from this viewpoint that social protection should be a public affair. That does not mean that private sector initiatives cannot play an important role. On the contrary, it does in many countries, and some private sector schemes offer even greater social protection than public schemes. The point of the universalists is that private sector initiatives should be organized within an overall social provisioning system in which the government plays the central role. However, in practice, opposing views easily walk together. Few supporters of universalism would reject safety net programs targeting particular groups, such as the poorest or women. They may even actively support these programs, considering them a first step towards universalizing social protection. Other issues of debate are matters of conditionality versus non-conditionality and in-kind contributions versus cash payments. Apart from practical benefits or disadvantages, controversies 3 and 4 reveal in fact underlying patronizing or respecting attitudes towards beneficiaries. And with this I have arrived at the second part of this lecture, social protection for livelihood enhancement. In lecture 5 I explained that in modern livelihood studies, understanding social exclusion is key. I also made clear that social exclusion is not a sample mechanism, but that it consists of multiple overlapping disadvantages the poor are confronted with. The way social protection enhances livelihoods and tries to counter and overcome social exclusion consists of 4 elements: protection, prevention, promotion, and transformation. The 4 categories are not necessarily in line, but they reflect rising ambitions of social protection, both in instruments and in goals. And that is why I present them as a ladder in the following graph. Protection aims for safeguarding minimum levels of consumption of those in poverty or at risk of falling into poverty. That is usually achieved through cash transfers, food distribution, food vouchers or food subsidies and subsidies on agricultural inputs. Safety nets of the structural adjustment period typically made use of these instruments. Prevention means preventing people whose livelihoods are susceptible to shocks and stresses from having to sell their assets and become even more vulnerable. Instruments are food or wages for work, school meals, health and unemployment insurances, and crop insurances. Promotion aims to foster people to become less vulnerable in the future to attain sustainable livelihoods. That may be achieved through asset building, such as soil and water conservation, livestock reconstitution, or building rural infrastructure, providing access to markets and microfinance, and providing vocational and agricultural training. Protection, prevention, and promotion can be considered as increased levels of ambition regarding the economic component of social protection. Transformation is the social component and the apex, the moral aspiration of social protection. Transformative social protection tackles the root cause of social exclusion. It means awareness raising, strengthening the agency of the poor, building their empowerment so that they are able to exert their rights. It means tackling the societal structures of domination and marginalization. Note that in development practice, these four components of livelihood enhancements may well overlap. Protection, prevention, and promotion are often integrated in so-called graduation programs, graduation out of poverty. These are phased interventions that support the poorest in an integrated way to achieve sustainable livelihood and thus move out of poverty, often within a specific period. Graduation programs consider asset accumulation as the key to well-being and livelihood security. Extreme poor people are unable to pull themselves above the poverty line because of lack of resources, lack of access to resources, education and health, and because of social exclusion. Graduation programs provide short-term transfers of assets, cash or food, together with support for asset creation, savings, training and mentoring, as well as a vehicle to economic empowerment. Often, graduation programs enroll poor people for a specific period. But exiting a graduation program at the end of that specific period does not necessarily mean that the household's livelihood has improved, let alone that a sustainable livelihood has been achieved. The reason for that is that it is too simple to expect that a one-size-fits-all approach will do. Household trajectories are manifold and depend on household characteristics, such as dependency rate, labor constraints, and female-headedness, on initial resources available. Some initial land or small business is usually a better feeding ground to productively absorb cash transfers, and on the external context of shocks and stresses and of course social exclusion. All these factors determine in a combined action whether households will be able to reap quickly the gains from the graduation program or not. A linear progression out of poverty is therefore not plausible, while as you can see from the slide, most programs present it as a linear progression, a staircase to the sustainable livelihood heaven. These linear projections are persistent misrepresentations in development programs and development studies at large. Remember, for example, the linear progress of societies in modernization theory, which I discussed in lecture 3. But in practice, development is not linear. Development is a fuzzy, messy transformation process with ups and downs and steps back and forward. And the trajectory out of poverty is a bumpy road. So how does social protection look in practice? And is it able to tackle social exclusion and to provide ways to sustainable livelihood? That is what we will find out in the next lecture, lecture 7, when I will examine 3 countries with major social protection schemes: India, Ethiopia, and Brazil. Meanwhile, you have the opportunity to complete some coursework and to join me in my online class on social protection policies. This short course on livelihood research uses the so-called flipped classroom model. This usually means that students go through lower levels of cognitive learning during their preparations before class starts. This enables students to engage in higher levels of learning in class with fellow students and the lecturer. You, dear YouTube viewers, can also take this short course through a flipped classroom. In practice, it means that for each lecture, your coursework consists of 5 successive parts, watching the video whenever it suits you. If you are interested, there is also mandatory literature to read. The mandatory literature clarifies issues already discussed in the lecture. To a large extent, you encounter again the issues of the lecture, but the mandatory literature also examines some issues more in depth. 3, if you like, I can also provide optional literature. The optional literature presents additional explanations on relevant issues and offers practical, contemporary, and inspiring examples on how to organize research on particular issues. Of course, you are advised to read the optional literature attentively, but if you have little time, you should at least glance through it. Or I can send you an assignment. The assignment enables you to apply the subject material discussed in the lecture and the mandatory literature. Finally, after having completed these 4 steps, you have the opportunity to participate in an online class, either individually or in small groups. Date and time of online classes will depend on your wishes and what your schedule allows. During that online class, 1 class per lecture, you will have the opportunity to raise questions for clarification, to formulate critique, and then to engage in applying the subject material by discussing the assignment. It's best to complete steps 1 to 4 before moving on to the next lecture, and it's mandatory for participation in the online class. The reason for that is simple. By completing these 4 steps first, you will have achieved already the lower levels of cognitive learning, and it means that the online class will become much more productive and challenging because you as students, with your fellow participants, and me as your lecturer, will be able to engage in the higher levels of learning. So start your lecture by watching the video. Then on your request per mail, I will make available various materials. That is a document explaining the didactical approach, the mandatory and optional literature, and the assignment. Don't worry, all docs are open access. Date and time of online class will depend on your wishes and what your schedule allows. So, thank you for now. Thank you for joining me. And I hope to see you again in the next lecture and in the online class on social policies. The next lecture will be on social protection schemes in India, Ethiopia, and Brazil. Bye-bye.